Even before the Civil War, the nation was divided, North and South. Slavery was at the heart of issues involving economics, politics, and sectional power. These issues boiled over in the halls of Congress, at Harper's Ferry, and elsewhere. The slave labor of the agricultural South was the fuel that drove the region's economy. The industrial North was driven by a manufacturing-based economy. This diversity helped fan the flames of secession and would have significant impact upon the coming war. The presidential election of 1860 proved to be the final spark that tore the country apart. Nominees Stephen Douglas and John C. Breckinridge represented the North and South respectively. The Constitutional Union Party sent John Bell as their candidate, with Abraham Lincoln as the Republican Party's nominee. Lincoln's anti-slavery views were seen by many Southerners as a direct threat to their way of life. Therefore, when Abraham Lincoln won the election of 1860, Southern states were outraged. On December 20, 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. 6 other states soon followed, forming the Confederate States of America. With the Union dissolved, civil war was inevitable. By March 1861, nearly all the forts and naval yards in the Second States had been seized by the new government. Charleston Harbor was among a handful of coastal strongholds that remained in federal possession. When South Carolina seceded from the Union, there were 3 U.S. fortifications in Charleston Harbor. Castle Pinckney was built in 1810 to provide for inner harbor defense. By 1860, it was in need of major repair, and its garrison consisted of only 2 people, a widowed sergeant and his teenage daughter. Fort Moultrie, first built in 1776, with succeeding forts built on the same site, was completed in 1809. With 50 cannon mounted, it served as the major fortification to defend Charleston Harbor until the beginning of the war. Fort Sumter was an imposing sight. Sitting on a man-made island, the brick fort was 90% complete in 1860 and the most defensible fortification in Charleston Harbor. In November 1860, Major Robert Anderson assumed command of U.S. fortifications in Charleston Harbor, headquartered at Fort Moultrie. Soon after South Carolina seceded, Major Anderson moved his command of 85 officers and men to Fort Sumter, under cover of darkness. Fort Sumter was the safest and most defensible position he could hold against attack with a limited number of men and supplies at hand. Charlestonians were outraged, and within a few days, South Carolina militia had seized all federal property in the area except Fort Sumter. They occupied Castle Pinckney and seized Fort Moultrie. In defiance of the federal presence in Charleston Harbor, the Southerners rebuilt batteries and constructed new fortifications on Sullivan's Island, on Morris Island, and on James Island. When Anderson and his troops first entered Fort Sumter, the fort was far from complete. For 3 months, Anderson prepared Fort Sumter for combat. By April 12th, however, fewer than half the needed cannon were ready, and even these lacked soldiers to man them. As the Federals strengthened Sumter, Confederate forces could be seen building batteries and mounting cannons along the harbor shore. 43 Southern cannon were trained on Fort Sumter, and more than 3,500 Confederate soldiers manned Charleston Harbor defense. Anderson was running low on provisions, and in January, a Federal relief ship left New York with supplies for Fort Sumter. When the Star of the West appeared at the entrance to Charleston Harbor, cadets from Charleston's elite Citadel Military Academy opened fire upon the unarmed ship. The Star of the West turned back without reaching the fort. By April of 1861, Major Robert Anderson was in a tight fix. Confederates surrounded Fort Sumter and were expected to attack at any time. To avoid war, the Confederate government ordered General P.G.T. Beauregard to demand the evacuation of Fort Sumter, and if refused, to reduce it. His aides visited Fort Sumter twice under flag of truce and presented Anderson with the ultimatum, but without success. At 4:30 a.m. on April 12th, a shot fired from Fort Johnson on James Island burst over Fort Sumter and signaled the Confederate batteries in Charleston Harbor to commence an assault on the fort. The Civil War had begun. At daybreak, Union forces opened fire in response. Charlestonians watched as the bombardment of the fort continued for 34 hours. During the second day of the battle, artillery fire from Fort Moultrie set parts of Fort Sumter on fire. With so few men, Anderson could not fight the fire and the Confederates at the same time. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, arrangements were made for Anderson to surrender the fort. On April 14, 1861, after a 50-gun salute to the U.S. flag, Anderson and his men withdrew to New York aboard a Union supply ship. Shortly after, Confederate forces occupied Fort Sumter, with photographers right behind. For the next 4 years, Fort Sumter became a symbol. For the South, it was sacred ground, where the first shot in the war for Southern independence was fired. For the North, Fort Sumter symbolized secession and disloyalty. U.S. Navy ships formed a blockade to keep Southern cargo vessels from using Charleston's port. On April 7, 1863, the war returned when 9 Federal gunboats attacked Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie. After 2.5 hours, the artillery duel was over, leaving the Federals without their prize. For the next 20 months, Union forces bombarded Fort Sumter in an attempt to force surrender. They tried amphibious landings, but without success. Union attacks had a devastating effect upon Fort Sumter, with walls crumbling and cannons dismounted. By late 1863, it resembled a giant pile of rubble. Finally, as the war's end neared, Fort Sumter was evacuated. On April 14, 1865, Anderson came out of retirement to raise the U.S. flag once again over Fort Sumter. The war was over.